I recently had to set up Aruba Clearpass with two Cisco controllers. One Cisco controller was the inside controller on the network, and they also had a DMZ Anchor controller. Most of you won't have this Anchor controller, but in some applications, very secure networks, they're going to have an Anchor controller where all the guest traffic is dropped out, or this is tunneled into the DMZ, and then all the user traffic exits onto the DMZ. So this was the setup. I'm not a Cisco wireless guy, so I had no idea on the setup and how it was actually talking to Clearpass. And you'll see that Cisco uses this virtual interface of either 1.1.1.1 or 192.0.2.1, depending on the version of code that you're on. But both controllers have that IP address on their virtual interfaces, and you'll see that the guest tries to post back to the controller. And since both of the IP addresses were the same on the virtual, I wasn't 100% sure if it was posting to the internal controller or to the external controller. So I set this up, and I set up traffic flow, and this is what I've learned. So I'll go through the process, and I'll set everything up pretty much as it's new, and show you what I had to do. So if we start off, here's my two controllers. If we go back to the drawing, you'll see that I have my inside controller and then my DMZ controller here. So we'll go through the process of setting up the wireless LANs and setting up a mobility anchor, and then we'll talk a little bit about how that flow of traffic is for the guest to speak to the Clearpass. So let's first go in. What we can do is we can go into our wireless LANs. We can create a new wireless LAN. Now your wireless LAN should be your wireless LAN. Everything that you create, make them exactly the same as the inside controller and in the DMZ. Now your access points are going to terminate to this inside controller. So this is where they're going to come up, but make everything the same on the DMZ. So let's just try this and call it, let's just call it guest test. And that's what will make the SSID also. And you can see this has the ID of number 1. People that are familiar with Aruba Wireless, we pass through to Clearpass. We pass through the name of the wireless LAN, where Cisco, we pass through the SSID or the wireless LAN's ID, and this is going to be number 1. So let's click apply. Let's go into my security. We're going to do layer 2 security none. Layer 3 security, I'm going to say web policy. I'm going to say enable captive. Well, this is up to you if you want the captive network assistant bypass. So I'll click enable. I've had some issues where the captive assistant was giving me issues on some newer iPhones and things like that. So I'm going to put enable. I'm just going to do authentication for now. What I would typically do, because with a guest you would probably want to do MAC caching also. So I would typically do on MAC filter failure, and then send it to the captive portal. But just to make things simple for right now, we're just going to do authentication. I already made a pre-auth ACL. I'll show you that ACL in a minute. I made it on both the inside and anchor controller. And then you want to enable global config override. And we're going to say external to go to the Clearpass box. What you can do is we can go into our Clearpass, and if we go to our Clearpass Guest, And if I go to my configuration, I look at one of my pages, I'll get this Galleria skin, and then I can copy this. And I am going to put that in here as my redirect. Okay. And I'm going to click apply. And the other things that you have to do is AAA servers, you have to assign your Clearpass servers. So I already defined them, so I can just put them in here, but I'll show you where to define them. And then also, I'm going to get rid of these two things and hit apply. Okay, go to advanced and enable AAA override. So I'll click apply. Now we're going to do the same thing on our Anchor or DMZ controller. So I'm going to create a new wireless LAN. Let me see what I called the other one. I called it just guest test. So let's copy it. And I would make the numbers match. So this is 1 on this controller. This was also number 1. Just for simplicity and to try to make sure that everything is the same, I would make them the same number. So I'm going to click apply, security. I'm going to say none on layer 2, layer 3. I'm going to go to web policy. I'm going to say enable, and I'm going to do my pre-auth ACL. I'm going to do my override here. We're going to say external to go to Clearpass. Let me copy this page again. And we'll put this in. And I also want to make sure that I enable AAA override. Click apply. Okay, so we have those set up the same. The SSID is exactly the same on my guest and on my Anchor, or sorry, on my internal and on my Anchor controller. So that should actually be showing up now in here. So here it is. And that should redirect me. So right there, that is redirecting me to this page on my Clearpass. So the next thing I want to do, though, is I want to make sure that this goes across the tunnel. So to do that, we have to set up mobility. So I'm going to go into controller, and I am going to go to mobility management. Now, you can check this box if you want, or uncheck it. This will just use different ports with the new mobility. I'm going to check it because it simplifies it if you're going through firewalls. What you can also do is, just make sure you have it the same on both sides. So if you do it on that side, you got to make sure it's checked on this side. Okay, so on the Anchor. So let's take a look at that again. That is fine. Now we're going to go to mobility groups, and we're going to create a new one. Now, when you create the mobility groups, you just have to tell each controller the MAC address and the IP address of the other side. So you can copy the MAC address here, or another place you could get it from is if you go to interface management, you copy the MAC address, and then you go on the remote side and go to mobility groups, and you add a new one, and you add in the remote side's IP address. So I'm on the Anchor, so I'm going to add the internal. And I copied its MAC already, so I'm going to put it in here. These group names have to match. So if it's Cisco_employee on this side, it has to be the same on the other side. So let's click apply. And you're seeing right now it says control and data path is down. That's fine. So now let's copy the MAC address from this controller so we can make the mobility group on the other side. So now I'm on the internal controller. I'm going to do mobility group, new, members IP is the IP of the DMZ controller. click apply. Okay, so both say control and data path are down. That's fine. They will eventually come up. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into the wireless LAN, and we are going to click on it, and we're going to say mobility anchor. Okay, so now we're going to create the mobility anchor, and what we want to do is the switch IP address on the inside controller, you're going to point it towards the DMZ. Okay, so that's important. That is the IP address of this anchor controller. So that's what you want. And then you do create, and it says up right now. Now we have to do the same thing on the anchor side, but there is one thing that is a little bit different. So when we click on mobility anchor here, we use the local IP address of the anchor because we want the traffic to drop off into this local DMZ. So now we're going to say create, and we have up. So we created the mobility anchor, and we now have this wireless LAN dumping into the DMZ. So a way to test it is I could go up here now and join it, and I should get a 192.168.2.2 address because that is that's the IP address that we have in the DMZ. So I have to wait for the network to appear. Okay, so this network isn't appearing because I forgot to enable it. So let's go back to the wireless LANs. When we click on here, got to check that box right there. Okay, and we have to do it on both sides. So enabled, click apply, and now the SSID should show up in this list, and there it is. And if I join it, and there we go. If I check, there it is. I got an IP address in the DMZ on the 192.168.2 network. So that's how you simply create, an anchor controller and to dump into the DMZ. Now, how does it talk to Clearpass? So, like I said, I'm not a Cisco wireless controller guy, so I was trying to figure out how is this going to work. If we look at I can't talk to it now, so I need to switch back to my internal network to be able to talk to it. So let me get on that network. Okay, so what we have is, if you look in here, we have these interfaces. So there's a virtual interface. This is what when people go into the captive portal and they talk to Clearpass, they're gonna talk to Clearpass, but they're gonna eventually post to this virtual IP address. Now, there is a virtual interface on both controllers. I have different IP addresses in here because I was testing to see which interface I was going to. Was I actually going to the 1.1.1? So I changed this IP address, and I wanted to see if it made a difference. Because they always tell you everything has to match between the internal controller and the anchor. Well, this doesn't have to match. Everything is being posted to this virtual IP address. So this is the IP address that matters. And you also want to make sure that you have the certificate is on the anchor, and this is the IP address, whether it's 1.1.1.1. And when you put a certificate on, this is where you're going to put the host name. So put a host name in here, put the entry in your DNS, and when you go into security, you're going to see here's the certificate, right? So you can so now if I change the IP address away from this 1.1.1.1, if I change it to 192.0.2.1, I'd have to reboot the controller, wait for it to come back up, and then regenerate a new certificate so it changes to the new IP address. So anyway, if you put a real store-bought cert on, which I highly recommend, then you want to make sure that you're using the you're using this IP address. It matters on the Anchor controller. The Anchor, if you sniff the traffic, the Anchor is going to be talking to Clearpass, not the virtual interface of the internal controller. So that is something that is important. Now, on the Clearpass side, so if we go into if we go to the management interface of Clearpass, we want to make sure. Now, how do you set up the service? Right, you could go in here and you could do a new service template in Wizard, and you could use 802.1x wireless, or you could just go into services and click add and make a new service, and you could select 802.1x wireless, and you can see that it adds in these two rules, right, these two matches, and it's set to match all of the conditions. But what you want to do for Cisco Wireless, you want to go in here and you want to go and you want to select radius airspace, and you can do wireless LAN ID equals number 1. Now, it's number 1 only because on my wireless LANs the number is 1. If you created a new wireless LAN and it was 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, that is what has to match in here in Clearpass. Okay, so you create that. If you just want to test it, you can then go back here to authentication. Now, if you look on the Cisco controller, if you go into the controller and you do right here, web authentication is PAP. So here in my Clearpass, if I want to go in here, what I can do is, if that's PAP, this is going to have to be PAP. Okay, so I'm not doing EPEEP. I can remove it. I'm not doing EAP fast. I'm not doing TLS at this time, so I could remove all these. Okay, and my authentication source is going to be my guest user repository in here. Now, you could set up roles and do different times a day and different role mappings and things like that, but you don't have to. And here's my default enforcement policy that I'm allowing all, right? With the Cisco, you could put in a policy here that, puts a timestamp or updates the controller with a timestamp, or, other parameters. There's some good documents on that line online if you want to. But for right now, we're just going to call this, we'll give this a name of like Cisco WLC Guest Test. So that is my service, and it's going to be down here at the bottom. I can move it up here to the top if I want it. But now that matches, that will match on my controller. So let's hit save. Make sure in your firewall, read, there's different ports that need to be opened. Got to get this to come up here. These are the ports that I had to open in the firewall to work. So all the communications in the firewall that we could see were between Clearpass and the Anchor controller, the IP address of the Anchor controller. And my IP address is 192.168.2.2. Now, if there's a NAT in the firewall, you're going to need that IP address that's facing the internal IP, network. You're going to need that IP address because that's going to also be talking to the Clearpass. So make sure that you have open ports 1812 and 1813 for radius, 32771, and for COA 3799. Two other things I wanted to show you, because I set them up ahead of time when I was going through my configuration, was I wanted to show you the access control list. So I made this pre-auth ACL. So you'll see on both sides when you go into the wireless LAN, and we went to security, layer 3, we had this pre-auth ACL here. So before guest users authenticate, they're going to have this ACL tied around them, and they need to be able to talk to Clearpass. So if you look what we did on both sides, if you click this pre-auth ACL, these are the rules, right? So we were allowing anything outbound. We were permitting in DHCP, so you see the direction is inbound, and we're allowing the DHCP in. And we're also allowing inbound Clearpass. So this is the IP address, any communication from my Clearpass box. So this is the IP address of my Clearpass server. So this is my pre-auth ACL. It is the same on both of these boxes. So there's my pre-auth ACL. And if you don't, if you wanted to create a new ACL, call it whatever you want. Just click on new, give it a name. So I'll just say test guest ACL. And when you click apply, this is where you go in and add your rules in. One other thing that I wanted to show you, because when we were going through our setup and we were in our wireless LAN, I scrolled down here on our AAA servers and I added these authentication servers. Well, I already had them configured, so I just wanted to quickly show you where those are configured. So if you go to security and you go to radius authentication, what you want to do is click on new and add in the IP address. So let's click new. You're going to add in the IP address of your Clearpass server and the shared secret. Right, so put a shared secret here, confirm it, leave it at 1812. Support for COA, I would say yes, enabled, and then save that. So you want to do that. You also want to set up accounting. So click on new and do the same thing. You want radius counting set up also. Okay, so that's where you set up your authentication and your accounting. That we went and we configured later at this spot. Okay, so there you go. So just to try to make this video as complete as possible, in Clearpass also, you want to make sure that you add in your wireless controllers as NADs. So you would go in the Clearpass Policy Manager and you would go into Network and Devices and make sure that you add in your 2 wireless LAN controllers. So just click add. When it comes up, give it a name, give it its IP address and the shared secret that you gave to the Cisco controllers on the other side. Make sure you select Cisco. This defaults to Aruba and I forgot to change it a couple times. And check the radius COA, and you can leave it at 3799. So do it for both of your controllers. Do it for your DMZ Anchor and for your internal controller. Add both of those in as NADs or as devices on here. And I guess the last bit of advice I would give is try to make sure that your internal controller and your Anchor controller are on the same version of code. Now, the company that I was setting this up for, their internal controller and their Anchor controller were on different versions of code, and it worked, but you may run into issues. So I would try to make them the same version of code. The reason being is, you'll see they always tell you, make sure that when you set up your wireless LANs and everything, that everything matches. Make sure that these tabs all match, and you want to make sure that they match all the way around. But if you're on different versions of code, I found that I would go in and there would be different checkboxes in here. And if I had something on an older version of code, it may be missing these checkboxes. And you may have a configuration mismatch, and the tunnel might not come up to the Anchor controller. So I'd say, as a bit of advice, to try and make sure that both of the controllers are on the same version of code. Thanks, and I hope this helps.